Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I'm going to talk about books I haven't read. So this is the Why Haven't I Read This tag, created by Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads, based on an original video by Crystal at Fibre Artsy. And it's a very simple short tag, so just 6 questions, talking about books that you haven't read that you feel like you probably should have. So let me go through the list of questions and talk about some books I haven't read. So the first one is a classic book that you haven't read. So I'm not big on classics, and there are many classics that I haven't read. I'm trying to put that right partly this month by reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen finally, but there are lots and lots of classics I haven't read. I've only read, for example, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. That's the only Dickens book I've read. So yeah, my reading of classics is pretty awful. And that's because, they're not the kind of books that I gravitate to. However, there are some classics that are the kind of books I gravitate to. And the one that sprung to mind for this was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. So I remember as a kid having a lovely hardback edition of that book and never reading it. And subsequently, I have still not read it. But I love that kind of adventure. I love kind of nautical stuff. I love submarines, and it just feels like I love giant squids attacking submarines. So it feels like the sort of book I would really enjoy. So I'm going to make sure I get a copy of it from Project Gutenberg from my Kindle and read it, because I do feel like I should read that, and probably some other Jules Verne as well. Okay, the next one then is a fiction book. So for that, I'm going to choose a rather obscure one, but Captain Blood by Michael Blodgett, which is a apparently very violent revenge novel. So the reason I picked this is because I had this, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I had this as a teenager, this exact edition, not this copy, but this edition. So I had it. I picked it up in the charity shop. I don't know how old I was, but like 15 or 16. Thought it looked really good. And never read it. So I had it for a few years until I did my big catastrophic sell-off of books when I was in my, mid-20s, I guess. So I probably had the book for about 10 years and didn't read it. It then got sold off in the big sell-off. And I've subsequently bought another copy of it about, when did I buy it? I think I must have bought it after my 100 book challenge finished. So I probably had this copy for like 6 months. And I haven't read it yet. So me and this book have a long history of me not reading it, but I do definitely need to read it at some point. Okay, next one is a non-fiction book. So this one I don't have a physical copy of here because it's in the attic, but I did find it in one of my library tour videos the other day and remembered that I hadn't read it and ought to. And that is Lost at Sea, which is by John Ronson. So I've read a bunch of John Ronson books and really enjoyed all of them. And my wife bought me this copy of Lost at Sea when we were on holiday a good few years ago now, so at least 5 years ago, probably more than that, probably more like 6 or 7 years ago. And I still haven't read it, which is terrible because it looks really interesting. So it's about it. So John Ronson's a journalist. He writes these kind of non-fiction books about interesting topics, and this one is about people with like strange beliefs, basically. Every John Ronson book I've read, I've really enjoyed, but for some reason I haven't read this one. So yeah, I definitely need to get to that one. Okay, next one then is a genre book. So for this one, I was going to pick Black House by Stephen King and Peter Straub, the sequel to The Talisman. So I read The Talisman when I was a teenager, so many years ago, and really liked it. I reread it quite recently. But despite the fact that this came out over 20 years ago, I still haven't read it. I really like Stephen King. I really like the Peter Straub books I've read. I haven't read as much Straub as I have King, but I really like the Peter Straub books I've read as well. And I really like The Talisman. And yet I haven't read this yet. I think part of the reason that I haven't read it recently is a few years ago I very foolishly decided that I was going to do a read through of the Dark Tower series, which is another series of genre books that I haven't read. I've read the first few, but I haven't finished the series. I decided I was going to do this read through that I found online, where you have to read all of the Stephen King books that relate in some way to the Dark Tower as well. So lots of his books have elements of kind of Dark Tower lore or references to the series and things like that in them, including Black House. And if you do that read through, it's about 35, 40 books, I think. So I did start doing that, and I think I probably got about 12 or 13 books into it, maybe more than that. Maybe it was as many as 20 books into it, and then stopped. But Black House was one that I hadn't got to yet, so I reread The Talisman as part of that Dark Tower read through, and really did enjoy it. So yeah, I definitely need to read this, but whether I'm going to pick up that Dark Tower read through from where I got to and continue it, or whether I'm just going to read Black House on its own, I'm not sure. But I do also need to finish the Dark Tower series. Okay, final question then, apart from the obligatory Tags and People question, is the book you've owned for the longest time and not read yet. So this is, so I suppose Captain Blood could kind of be a contender for that, given I used to own it and then got rid of it. But the one I'm going to go with, again, is in the attic and I can't be bothered to go and find it, is Dance Macabre. So again, a Stephen King book. So his non-fiction book about the horror genre. So I was given a copy of that book by a very, very close friend of mine. And it must have been, I was in my early 20s. So probably 27 years ago, something like that. And I still haven't read it, which is terrible, isn't it? So there are, I don't know why, because it's a book I've heard lots of people talk about. I've read a lot of books about the horror genre, horror cinema in particular, but the horror genre in general. I studied film at university, and particularly, wrote about, a lot of my dissertations and things like that were about horror cinema. So the fact I haven't read Dance Macabre anyway seems a bit crazy, and the fact that I haven't read it after being given it as a gift is even worse. So I do need to get to that one at some point. Okay, right. So final question then is to tag some people. So I don't think any of these people have done this, but if you have, apologies. So the 3 people I'm going to tag are Book Talks with Mrs. Thomas, MJ at Reading This Life, and Anne at Anne with a Book. Okay, time for another random book from the shelves. Today's book is The Black Curtain by Cornell Woolrich. So Woolrich, if you don't know him, was an excellent writer of kind of noirish suspense novels in the 40s and 50s in particular. This one's from the 60s. And I discovered him through these lovely Ballantine editions, which my local library had a few of when I was a teenager. So I read a few of them back then, really, really enjoyed them. Probably his most famous book, the book isn't famous, but he wrote the story that the Hitchcock film Rear Window was based on. So that's probably the most famous thing he ever did. But his novels are great, really suspenseful, really dark. He had a pretty tragic life. And yeah, I can't remember if I read this one back when I was a teenager or not, but I managed to pick up a few Woolrich books a little while ago, so I need to read this one again. I did read one of his, The Bride Wore Black, a little while ago, and it was brilliant. It was absolutely fantastic, so I'm definitely keen to read a bit more by him again. Okay, hope you enjoyed that video. Do let me know if there are any really notable books that you haven't read and that you feel like you ought to. But yeah, as always, thank you for watching. I hope you're safe and well. Hope you're really good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.